Now we know more about all these topics than we ever did before. Well, tonight we're going to go to our main event right now. That's the speaker, Keith Bohannon. Keith is 11 years in the National Park Service. He knew almost as many people as Ed Barstow does, but he does not gossip about them like Ed does. I should say. Keith is now a professor at West Georgia, teaching history for the most part and enlightening students on the Civil War. He has appeared on C-SPAN. He's the author of a book, two books that I know of: A Diary of a Georgia Soldier and one of the H.E. Howard series. Numerous articles. He's been on tours with Ed Bars, and we'll tell you stories about him too. Not about himself, but about Ed, of course. Tonight he's going to be talking about a topic that he hopes to write a book on one of these days, which is Joe Wheeler's Cavalry in the Atlanta Campaign. And I'm encouraging him to do that because it's one of the few topics, I think, of the Civil War that really need a re-examination, or a thorough examination, I should say. And we know that Keith will do it. So without further ado, Keith Bohannon.
Bruce, to move the slides to
I'll
this.
I'll do it when you...
Oh, okay.
All right.
Confederate Cavalry General Joe Wheeler was a very controversial officer during the Civil War and remains one today among historians. That's one of the things that makes him so fascinating to me, is how divergent the opinions are of Wheeler. If you look at campaign studies, battle studies by historians just within the last few decades, they have very different opinions of Wheeler's efficacy as a cavalryman. Wheeler graduated near the bottom of his class, as we learned, in West Point in 1859. He then served for a brief time in the Dragoons and Mounted Rifles before secession, where he resigned from the U.S. Army. His initial service in the Confederate lieutenant in the artillery. Then he was an infantry commander at Shiloh, and then received a promotion to command a cavalry brigade in Braxton Bragg's 1862 Kentucky campaign. And as most of you probably know, after the Battle of Perryville, the major engagement in that campaign, Bragg decided to retreat back south into Tennessee. And as Bragg's army did so, Wheeler was given the task of conducting rear guard actions to keep the Federals at arm's distance. And Wheeler performed exceptionally well in this role. He attracted Bragg's attention. Bragg admired Wheeler, who was a professional soldier, and as a result, Bragg promoted Wheeler to command the cavalry corps of what was, at the time, this is in the immediate wake of the Kentucky campaign, the Army of the Mississippi, what later became the Confederate Army of Tennessee. And Wheeler remained the commander of the Army of Tennessee's Cavalry Corps for the rest of the Civil War. That's something to keep in mind, I think, when you look at modern opinions of Wheeler, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. He served throughout 1862 and 1863 and a number of other campaigns. And my focus tonight is going to be on the 1864 Atlanta campaign. So he was active in the Murfreesboro campaign, conducting a raid around the Union Army of William Rosecrans. He was active in the Chickamauga and Chattanooga campaigns. And on the eve of the Atlanta campaign, at the end of April of 1864, Wheeler's corps, which consisted of 3 divisions, numbered about 8,500 men present for duty, but of those, only 2,400 were effective, which means they were fully equipped and had mounts. One of the great weaknesses or handicaps that plagued the Confederate cavalry in both theaters or all theaters throughout the conflict was that shortages of mounts. While the United States Army provided mounts for its cavalrymen, Confederate horsemen or Confederate cavalrymen were tasked with finding their own mounts. And so at any point in time, there were always large numbers of officers and men from Confederate cavalry regiments who were trying to find horses, who weren't with their units. One of the other challenges with maintaining cavalry is feeding those horses on a daily basis. And it requires a staggering amount of fodder. So at the advent of the Atlanta campaign, with Sherman's Army group in Chattanooga, and then at just a short distance, about 25, 30 miles south of Chattanooga, the Confederate Army of Tennessee under Joseph E. Johnston was concentrated around the town of Dalton, Georgia. Wheeler's men were spread out between Dalton and a town called Oxford in Alabama. These two towns are approximately 80 to 90 miles apart. And that's an enormous distance to spread your horsemen out. And they were spread out for several reasons. One was so the horses could subsist on forage in areas that the Army hadn't picked clean. But Wheeler's men were also tasked with trying to prevent or trying to guard, rather, the possible approach routes that Sherman's army would take when it wasn't if, it was when the Federals would start their offensive. And as you know, Sherman began his offensive in early May, the same time in North Georgia, with orders from Grant to occupy the Army of Tennessee, prevent Joe Johnson from sending reinforcements to Virginia, to Lee in Virginia, and then secondarily, Sherman was supposed to push into the interior of Georgia and capture the major city of Atlanta, which was a hub of industry and a very important hub of industry for the Confederacy, as well as a railroad hub. Wheeler's three division commanders, and I won't go into who they were, their background, had limited experience in the spring of 1864 commanding large bodies of cavalry. Two of them had just been promoted in the fall of 1863 to command cavalrymen. Two of them were professionals, one a West Point graduate in the class of 61, one a VMI graduate, but they all three performed fairly well in the campaign. Wheeler, throughout the winter prior to Sherman's advance in May of 1864, had been occupied to a large extent with trying to improve drill and discipline within the cavalry corps. This was something that Joseph E. Johnson appreciated. Johnson, like Bragg, respected Wheeler for his professional demeanor. Johnson adopted Joe Johnson in February of 1864 a tactics manual that Wheeler had authored. And let's see.
What happened?
Prior to this time, so prior to February of 1864, the Cavalry Corps had not had a standard tactics manual. They've been using 2 or 3 different tactics manuals. And here's the title page of Wheeler's revised edition of Cavalry, or revised manual of cavalry tactics, printed in Mobile by one of the leading Confederate publishers, Getzel. And it's worth looking at this manual briefly, just briefly, to get a sense of Wheeler's views on the role that cavalry should play in battle and in a campaign. Cavalry, he said, must exercise a powerful influence over the operation of a war by spreading terror over a large tract of country, carrying off convoys, rendering the enemy's communications difficult. Cavalry, he continued, should be constantly harassing the flanks and rear of the enemy. At the same time, Wheeler recognized the increasing importance of using cavalry as mounted riflemen. And this role of having men use their horses to get from point A to point B, but then fighting dismounted, is an apt description of what Wheeler's men did for the majority of their time during the Atlanta campaign. In mounted rifle regiments, Wheeler continued, the horses are principally used for reaching the point of attack, and such troops are almost invariably fought on foot and used in many respects in a manner similar to light infantry. Mounted riflemen were important. He continued in covering the retreat of an army, and that's really where Wheeler excelled on a number of occasions. As I mentioned, with the Kentucky campaign in 1862, serving as a rear guard. They're also important in obstructing the advance of the enemy. During the first week of May 1864, this was the critical opening phase of the Atlanta campaign with the main Confederate Army at Dalton. Unfortunately for the Confederates, while Wheeler protected the approaches to Dalton, and I apologize for the small size of the map, but let me see. Does that work? No, that doesn't work. Wheeler was very effective in preventing Federals from approaching Dalton from the north, but then just west of Dalton is a very steep ridge that runs from north to south. It's called Rocky Face Ridge. And there were gaps in Rocky Face that would allow for the passage of Union troops from west to east, the Confederates being on the east side of Rocky Face Ridge. And one of these gaps, south of Dalton, called Snake Creek Gap, was unfortunately for the Confederates left unguarded. And this was important because not very far east of that gap was Johnson's main supply line, the Western and Atlantic Railroad. This was a railroad that ran about 100 miles from Chattanooga, which was its northern terminus, to Atlanta. And both armies relied on the Western and Atlantic as their main supply line during this campaign. So for Johnson, it was important it was always important, vitally important, to keep the Federals from cutting the supply line, the Western Atlantic, between his army and Atlanta, right? And Snake Creek Gap, being left unguarded, presented Sherman an opportunity to push troops through Rocky Face Ridge, through this gap, south of Dalton, south of Johnson's army, and cut the Western and Atlantic at a small community called Resaca. And Wheeler certainly deserves some of the blame for not having a sufficient force in Snake Creek Gap to prevent some of Sherman's men from moving through it. But Johnson also deserves blame. He's, after all, the Army commander. He had been in Dalton for many months, and he bore, I think, a good bit of the responsibility for not recognizing the significance of this gap. The first major battle of the campaign, fortunately though for the Confederates, the commander of the Union Army of the Tennessee, James B. McPherson, got his troops through Snake Creek Gap, but then because he felt that the Resaca and the railroad were too heavily guarded by the Confederates, which was not the case, he hesitated. He had a real opportunity, the Union General McPherson, who Grant and Sherman thought very, very highly of, to break the Confederate rail line there at Resaca. McPherson didn't. Johnson managed to fall back and take up a position at Resaca, and that's where the first major battle of the campaign took place. Wheeler's role at Resaca, as was his role throughout the campaign, with just a few exceptions, was to protect the flanks of Johnson's infantry force, which dug in. This was a campaign like the Overland Campaign, where the soldiers on both sides were constructing earthworks, miles and miles of earthworks. Throughout the next phase of the campaign, after Johnson retreated south from Resaca, Wheeler's men covered the retreat of the main infantry forces, and then as Johnson fell back from one line to another, falling back toward Atlanta, Wheeler's men were in the trenches, protecting the flanks, the right flank in particular, of Johnson's army. Johnson received a substantial number of reinforcements from Mississippi, Leonidas Polk, and Polk's had a cavalry division with him that didn't serve directly under Wheeler, but so this other cavalry division under Red Jackson was his name, the Confederate general. He protected one flank, the western flank of Johnson's army. Wheeler was usually tasked with protecting the right flank. There were several occasions where Wheeler's men during the campaign played a very important role in protecting the flanks of the main army. And I'll just mention two of them. These are real highlights of when it comes to cavalry performance during the campaign for Joe Wheeler's units. One was at a place called Pickett's Mill. This is a state park. Hopefully y'all will go there when you do your Atlanta campaign tour. And there, the Federals under O.O. Howard, who many of you are familiar with, had a real opportunity to turn the flank of Johnson's army. Who held the Federals at bay long enough for Confederate infantry, some of the best in Johnson's army, laboring to come up? It was Wheeler's men, fighting dismounted against a very large Union infantry force, and Wheeler's men managed to hold the Federals at arm's length long enough for the infantry to come up. Wheeler's men also played an important role in the largest battle of the campaign, the Battle of Atlanta, fought just east of the city, where they assisted in repulsing attacks led again by James B. McPherson, who I mentioned earlier, who was trying to enter the city from the east. Although Wheeler's men then spent a lot of time in the ditches, that was the phrase that the soldiers often use in their correspondence to describe their service, the ditches being the trenches. Fighting Joe, as Wheeler was known, clearly preferred leading raids behind enemy lines. Remember, in his manual he said that the role of cavalry was to be constantly harassing the flanks and rear of the enemy. So throughout the campaign, Wheeler was constantly requesting permission from Joe Johnson, his immediate superior, to turn him loose, to turn the Confederate cavalry loose in the rear of Sherman's army, to harass the Western and Atlantic, or to break the Western and Atlantic Railroad, maybe even ride up into Tennessee and wreak havoc up there on Sherman's supply line. Because remember, Sherman's supply line, as he penetrated deeper and deeper into Georgia, became longer and longer. It stretched up to Chattanooga, and then up to Nashville and middle Tennessee, and then all the way up to the Ohio River at Louisville. Right, that's an enormous stretch of railroad to protect. So Sherman had to leave garrisons behind and blockhouses. And what Wheeler wanted his men to do, or wanted permission to do from Johnson, is conduct raids to destroy Sherman's supply line and force the Federals to abandon this campaign against Atlanta. And this desire on the part of Wheeler to conduct a raid is an element of a larger debate during the campaign that took place between Joe Johnson and the Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, right? And as y'all probably know, those two men despised each other. So that was a major handicap for the Confederates when you have the commander of one of the two largest field armies in your nation who despises the president, and it's mutual. Johnson kept telling Davis during the campaign that the Confederate War Department should order all the cavalry in northern Mississippi and Alabama up into Tennessee. This was under the command of, this department was under the command of the cavalry forces of Nathan Bedford Forrest. And so what Johnson said is, I can't afford to send Wheeler on a raid. I need Wheeler protecting the flanks of the Army of Tennessee because we're facing a much larger army under William T. Sherman, and I need the horsemen in the trenches extending the flanks of my main infantry line. That was Johnson's argument. Davis, though, was firmly opposed to stripping the states of Alabama and Mississippi of their main defender, Forrest Command. Davis made the point, and it was a good one, that doing so would open up those two states to federal incursions. And central Alabama in particular was a vital region for the Confederacy because of industrial cities like Selma and the rich agricultural region of the Black Belt of central Alabama, the Plantation Belt. Wheeler actually during the campaign on a number of occasions went over the head of Joe Johnson to weigh in on this debate that I just described by communicating with Braxton Bragg, who by this point in time in the spring and summer of 1864 was a military advisor to Davis. So Bragg had been relieved of command of the Army of Tennessee, right, after the disaster at Missionary Ridge. But after that, he didn't resign from the Army. He ended up going to Richmond and becoming a central advisor to Davis. And remember, Wheeler is a protege of Bragg. And so Wheeler, for example, on July the 1st of 1864, wrote a letter to Bragg, and this is one of several letters Wheeler wrote, where Wheeler said, I have begged General Johnson to allow me to go to the enemy's rear nearly every day for the last 3 months, and he is anxious that it be done, but states that my presence is necessary upon the flanks. Let me get and go up one more. There we go. So this map, which again I apologize for being a little out of focus, represents what's really the pinnacle of Wheeler's career, I think, during the Civil War. His response to Sherman's attempt at the end of July of 1864 to cut, using his cavalry, the Union cavalry, the Confederate supply lines leading into Atlanta. So by this point in time, by the end of July, the last few days of July of 1864, Johnson had been relieved of command by Davis. John Bell Hood, one of Johnson's corps commanders, had been placed in charge of the Army of Tennessee. Hood had gone on the offensive and right on the outskirts of Atlanta in some battles where the Confederates failed to achieve very much, but had suffered staggering casualties. Atlanta, Ezra Church. And at this same time, Sherman turned his cavalry loose in an attempt to try and cut the railroads leading into Atlanta from the south. Sherman knew if he could do that, that would force Hood to abandon the city. So Sherman sent one force under the command of Union General George Stoneman east and south of Atlanta with the goal, again, of cutting one of the railroads. McCook also had the wildly impractical notion that after cutting the railroad, he could continue south for a great distance to Andersonville or Camp Sumter and free all of those languishing prisoners in one of the worst hellholes in the Confederacy, the prison there. How he would have been able to get thousands upon thousands of starving and emaciated Union prisoners of war, the long distance back to Sherman's line he wouldn't have been able to. Sherman also sent another division around Atlanta to the west. So this is a two-pronged attempt on the part of Sherman to send troops to the Union cavalrymen east and west of Atlanta to unite, hopefully, south of the city and cut the rail lines. The other force that rode that left Sherman's line and rode west of the city west of Atlanta was under the command of a Union General George McCook. Wheeler then faces a true dilemma. He has a much smaller force of cavalry, and he has multiple Union movements east and west of the city. And Wheeler has to address both of these thrusts. So Wheeler divides his smaller force. This is a pretty bold move on Wheeler's part. He sends one of his subordinates to deal with Stoneman, and Stoneman is eventually meets defeat just north of Macon, which is in the central portion of Georgia, south of Atlanta. And Stoneman himself is captured and hundreds of his men. So the attempt to encircle Atlanta to the east results in a disastrous failure. Wheeler, though, personally leads the troops that his men who rode tirelessly east of the city to try and deal with McCook. And there, Wheeler also met with success in a fairly large battle. I don't know if it was as large as Brandy Station, but it was pretty damn close. At a place called Brown's Mill outside of a small town called Noonan. This is about 30 miles southwest of Atlanta. And there Wheeler, and this was a true cavalry engagement, mounted cavalry engagement like Brandy Station with charges and countercharges. Several of Wheeler's division commanders were captured and then in the course of the battle by the Yankees and then liberated and then captured again. So it was one of these wildly confusing battles in woods with open woods with charges and countercharges by both sides. But at the end of it all, Wheeler had managed to encircle and capture about 600 of these Federals, with the remainder, including McCook, finding themselves back to Union lines in small groups. Wheeler's defeat of the McCook-Stoneman Raid was costly to Sherman. Almost half of his army's cavalry became casualties as a result of this failed offensive. Most of these men, though, had been taken prisoners, so they ended up, instead of liberating Andersonville, they ended up becoming prisoners there. Again, this was clearly Wheeler's finest hour of the Civil War. There's an excellent book on the McCook-Stoneman Raid by David Evans called Sherman's Horsemen. It's one of the best tactical studies of the Civil War, I mean, in terms of the level of detail. And David says that Wheeler's relentless pursuit of McCook was nothing short of brilliant. So Wheeler had a lot of frustrating failures in his Civil War career, but this was a moment where he really shined. The defeat of the Stoneman-McCook raid convinced John Bell Hood to send Wheeler off on a raid of his own to ride north of Atlanta and cut, hopefully, Sherman's supply lines, the Western Atlantic, which I mentioned. Wheeler took off on a very lengthy raid, not only into North Georgia to try and cut the Western Atlantic, but also all the way up into East Tennessee. He essentially ignored the orders and timetable that he had been given as to where he was supposed to go and when he was supposed to get back to the Army of Tennessee. Wheeler did manage to do some damage. He rode up into East Tennessee and then all the way to Nashville. He had men detached along the way that went up into Southwest Virginia. Ultimately, when the raid ended and he crossed the Tennessee River in North Alabama at the beginning of September, so this is after Hood had evacuated Atlanta, Wheeler's force was a wreck. He had lost, his horses were exhausted, he suffered heavy casualties. His command, I think Forrest was shocked when he went to view Wheeler's command in terms of how small it was and how exhausted the men and the horses were. The raid had only done very minimal damage to railroads in North Georgia and Tennessee. So this had been really a performance that was almost the exact opposite of the McCook-Stoneman Raid in terms of successes. It had been a disaster for Wheeler. I'd like to conclude then with offering an assessment of Wheeler based on what some other historians have said. And these are folks, probably all of them, I suspect. Bruce and I were talking about this yesterday. I think all of these people have spoke at one point in time to your roundtable. So how do historians today assess Wheeler? And of course they look not only at the Atlanta campaign, but previous campaigns and Wheeler's performance during the March to the Sea. His army his cavalry corps was the main force facing Sherman as Sherman marched from Atlanta to Savannah. And then Wheeler's men campaigned through the Carolinas too. Richard McMurray, someone I admire a great deal, one of the really great historians of the Western theater, characterizes Joe Wheeler as being, quote unquote, utterly irresponsible when entrusted with a major operation. My good friend Dave Powell, who I really, really admire for a lot of reasons, and y'all have heard him, you're going to go on a battlefield tour with him. He's an extraordinary fellow. He wrote in his Chickamauga blog, and this was maybe a year or two ago, that Wheeler was a poor disciplinarian, a bad administrator, and a poor tactician. Pretty harsh criticism. And from the perspective of a historian, Wheeler's bad performance as an administrator is particularly frustrating because it likely contributed to the dearth of source material that exists today. If you look in the official records, which you're all familiar with, there's very, very little in there from Wheeler's Cavalry Corps when it comes to reports, right, from his division, brigade, regimental commanders. And it's not solely Wheeler's fault because when you have attrition in the ranks of officers, that's problematic, in terms of filling out composing official reports. But Wheeler was pretty bad as an administrator. The discipline of his cavalry corps became worse over time, which also affected morale of civilians, right? If you had horsemen ride into your yard and take all of your hogs and all of the corn in your corn cribs and they said they were under Wheeler, that's going to affect your morale and certainly your opinion of the Confederate cavalry. Albert Castell, on the other hand, who wrote what to date's probably the best single volume work on the Atlanta campaign. Y'all gave it out in your raffle tonight, Decision in the West. Castell said that Wheeler provided Joe Johnson with, quote-unquote, a capable, experienced commander for all his mounted forces, something that Sherman didn't have. And the McCook-Stoneman Raid illustrates that, I think, that Sherman didn't have have a cavalry commander that he could trust, at least in this campaign. Castell did say, however, that Wheeler had problems with discipline, like Dave Powell claims, and that Wheeler also had a penchant for making exaggerated claims about what the damage he inflicted on the enemy. And he was not alone in that regard, of course. Edward Longacre, who's written the only modern biography of Wheeler in 2007, says that Wheeler was at his best when defending the Army during retreats, as we mentioned already. His offensive record was mixed, especially when it came to leading raids deep behind enemy lines. And I think that's probably pretty accurate. Wheeler was clearly an officer with great strengths and great weaknesses. But his professional background and his strengths, I think, were enough that he was kept in command of the Cavalry Corps of the Army of Tennessee throughout the entire period of that Army's existence. And that's something a friend of mine, the late Nat Hughes, told me back in the late 90s when I lived in Chattanooga, and I was a member of the Chattanooga Roundtable. I was talking with Nat Hughes about Wheeler, and Nat Hughes made the point that Wheeler commanded even with all of his weaknesses, he commanded the respect of all the men who commanded the Confederate Army of Tennessee, and he was kept in command by Braxton Bragg, by Joe Johnson, by Hood, and then after Hood's disastrous Tennessee campaign, Johnson, when he was reappointed, right, in the Carolinas campaign. And I think that's something to keep in mind, that point that Wheeler maintained the confidence of his superiors from 1862 through 1865 when it comes to judging his abilities today. Thank you. Do we have, I don't have a clock on me. I have my phone out. Do we have time for a few questions?
Yeah,
One or two?
So.
Okay.
Questions?
Yes, sir.
Concerns?
Yeah. I have not fully read Castell.
Uh-huh.
Fully read Powell, but there is something about the Atlanta campaign and Wheeler that has always perplexed me.
Ah.
And it relates to Pickettsville, Dallas, and when Sherman deviates off the western of Atlanta.
Right.
And plunges deep into the woods.
Right.
He had been to Georgia before.
Right.
He knew that Alatoona Pass was like formidable.
Yes.
So if I'm John, and I know that Johnston left a tiny little amount of troops, Wheeler's, like a hit at Alatoona Pass.
Right.
And I think he knew that if he's able to stop him, the only thing that Sherman can do is swing back towards the western and Atlantic because it's a survival.
Right.
I've always been baffled why, knowing how impregnable that was, Sherman himself knew that it could easily be defended by a small group of people. Johnston left that so undefended. And
this is Alatoona Pass you're talking about?
Pass.
Right. Yeah.
I never understood that, because then Sherman comes back, he finds some defense, and he basically finds I can continue my the campaign. Seems like it could have stopped there if Alatoona Pass had been properly defended, because Sherman only had a limited amount of time to try and punch through those lines in the woods, Dallas and New Hope, before he had to come back to the railroad.
And that's what happened. Actually, is you're right. Is that
but the pass is undefended, and I'm just stunned at why he would leave it Johnston undefended.
Yeah, it would. If you see Alatoona Pass, the battlefield is well preserved today. There was a nasty fight there in October of 1864. So this is after the Atlanta campaign between federal garrison there and a division of Hood's army. The gap itself is artificial. It was constructed through a mountain to provide passage for the Western and Atlantic, the railroad we talked about. So it's probably maybe twice the width of this room. It's very narrow, and the documentation is poor for the Confederate defenses of the gap. In other words, there's not a lot to ascertain how much Johnson had fortified the gap itself or the Allatoona Mountains. The works that are there today, and they're substantial, were built by the Federals after after Johnson fell back and after the Federals seized the pass. And it became an important, I'm not directly answering your question, I realize that, but it became a very important supply base for Sherman along the railroad as he continued advancing south. And there's some great photographs taken by George Bernard, who captured the campaign in photographs of Allatoona Pass as a supply depot. But yeah, the battle that was fought there is fascinating, and it's the site itself is well preserved today. It's owned by the Corps of Engineers. But so to get back to your question, I don't know that the mountains to the east and west of Allatoona Pass itself are so rugged and so steep. I don't know how, and the road network is so kind of primitive that I don't know how Sherman could have pushed, or Johnson for that matter, a whole army through the Allatoona Mountains. And Johnson was only there for such a brief time. There's no evidence in either the written record or on the ground itself that he constructed fortifications there. There's maybe one small fort away that the Confederates built at some distance from the pass itself, but I don't know. I kind of ramble there, and I don't know if I answered your question or not.
It's more of a point that
Okay.
I don't know if it's in Castell, I don't know if
Right.
Al has covered it, but it just seems like it's such an easily defensible position, and they left it horribly unguarded, and they knew they had to swing back to the Western and Atlantic, and it seems like it could have been a stopgap right there. I mean, I don't know what fortifications were there. Like
Right.
The gap's very narrow, but you could have a very small defensive force and we lost a very large army. I've just always been surprised that it was left unguarded.
Yeah, the federal force there in October of 1864 was much smaller than the attacking Confederate division, and the division that attacked were some of the best troops in Hood's army, and they were repulsed. So, yes, sir.
Yeah, two questions, totally unrelated to one another.
Okay.
First, just before the Atlanta campaign, Pat Claiborne made his famous
Right.
suggestion.
Right.
Do we have any record at all of what Wheeler thought?
Yes. Yes, that's a great question. That's a wonderful question.
Well, while you're thinking about that one.
I like questions I can answer.
All right. Cashville.
Uh-huh.
Why don't we do one at a time?
Yeah, look, can we do one?
If we were supposed to
Kurt, one at a time and let-
decide, where the hell was he if he's not behind Hood's Corps, telling him that no, those guys aren't that formidable? Where was he? Why was he not there?
Wait, where are you talking about?
Cassville.
Oh, Cassville. Okay, I'll answer your first question. So there, what he's referring to is a proposal that in the, I think it's February, is that right, Bruce? Of February of 1864, when Patrick Claiborne proposes to the High Command of the Army of Tennessee that slaves be recruited into the Army. It was a highly controversial proposal amongst the the high command of the Army of Tennessee. The camps were divided in terms of sentiment. Claiborne had his supporters, but there were also a number of generals who were very loud and vocal in their denunciations of this proposal, and Wheeler was one who was adamantly opposed to it, along with W.H.T. Walker and William Bate and several others. So, and it's interesting because when you look at Wheeler's letters during the campaign to Braxton Bragg, right after Hood takes command of the Army, Wheeler praises a number of the division commanders in the Army, and there's one notable exception that he doesn't mention, and it's Patrick Claiborne. So, yeah, Wheeler, along with a small group of others, were very vocally opposed. And Jefferson Davis, of course, shut down any discussion of it at that point in time. So
what about Cassville?
Wheeler didn't have enough men east of the main Confederate force to. Most of Wheeler's command was west of Cassville in the main army. And there's a good book, actually, if you're interested in Cassville. My good friend Robert Jenkins wrote a whole book on the Cassville affairs that Mercer University published last year. It's got a ton of wonderful color maps in it, and I'd highly, highly recommend that. He goes into enormous detail about the controversy within the Confederate High Command there between Johnson on the one hand and his corps commanders Polk and Hood on the other.
What's Jenkins' first name?
Robert Jenkins. He's a lawyer in Dalton, Georgia, and an expert on the Atlanta campaign. Yeah, he's an expert on the Atlanta campaign. He's also written a book on the Peachtree Creek. He's very good. Yes, sir.
So, Keith, from your research, isn't it Wheeler's and Hood agreeing on a raid versus
Yes.
Wheeler covering one of the railroad lines that would have maybe kept them in Atlanta longer, kind of sped up. Do you think that sped up the demise of the Confederates being able to hold Atlanta? Because remember, political year.
That's a good question. Yeah.
By doing the raid and not protecting
Right.
one of those because they had to pick one of those lines because there were 3 or 4 going into the city.
Right.
And if they would have picked one,
They
they would have held out longer.
Okay.
Doing the raid. What do you think of that? Or
Yeah. By the time that Wheeler left on his raid up into North Georgia and then ultimately up into Tennessee, there's really only one railroad left leading into Atlanta that the Confederates control. It's called the Macon and Western, and it runs almost due south from Atlanta. Wheeler left behind. It wasn't really Wheeler's call. There was a division, I mentioned it briefly earlier, of Confederate cavalry that had been earlier under the command of Leonidas Polk in Mississippi and Alabama. It was under the command of William H. Red Jackson, and it was actually an independent command from Wheeler's Cavalry Corps. And so Jackson's division is left in Atlanta with Hood when Wheeler takes off. And Jackson's men are south of Atlanta, and they actually tell Hood about this movement. But Jackson's men were unable to stop the enormous force. I mean, when Sherman cuts loose from the siege lines around Atlanta, he takes almost his entire army with him on this swing west of the city and then south of the city. So Sherman's got multiple corps cutting the Macon and Western Railroad. And there's no way on earth that even if Wheeler's entire cavalry corps had been south of Atlanta to trying to defend the Macon and Western, that it could have done so. Hood sent 2/3 of his army down there, right, to try and protect the railroad. which resulted in the Battle of Jonesboro, a 2-day engagement where the Confederates lost heavily and weren't able to stop, weren't able to secure the railroad. The Federals had already torn up a lot of line north of Jonesboro. So I don't think, and I've read this, other historians, I don't think Wheeler's presence south of Atlanta would have changed the course of events, really, of what did happen. I mean, 2/3 of the Army of Tennessee couldn't stop the Union Army of the Tennessee and part of Thomas's Army of the Cumberland from cutting the railroad down there.
Okay, other questions, comments?
All right, thank y'all so much. Enjoyed it.